I want to ask you, why do you want to be the next mayor of Austin, and why now?
So Austin is really at a crossroads. You know, this is a wonderful city, it's a growing city, it's a vital city, but there are some real challenges that Austin is facing. And, you know, as I talk to Austinites throughout the city, many of them are struggling to stay here. The costs have really escalated in recent years. And I believe that this time calls for a mayor who is ready for that challenge, who brings the energy and the experience to some of those issues that I do. And, you know, as a council member and mayor pro tem, I worked on a lot of the issues that I believe are posing the biggest challenges to us right now, from homelessness to climate change to affordability.
You know, viewers, voters should be aware, they should know the name Kathie Tovo because you have served on council previously for so long. Talk to us about that experience, how
Sure.
long you were on council, and why not run sooner for mayor?
So I ran for council in 2011. I had a history at that point of community advocacy through my neighborhood association, through groups like the Austin Neighborhoods Council, various City of Austin and AISD committees, was very involved, particularly in affordable housing, or had a strong interest in affordable housing and education issues. And so I ran for council in 2011, was elected, ran against an incumbent, was elected citywide because we were still a citywide system. And then when we shifted to the district-based system, I ran and won twice, and so served as the District 9 representative, representing downtown areas south and north and east, but primarily central Austin.
And why run now for mayor?
Well, I looked at the issues that the city was facing and thought about the work that I had done on city council and thought, you know, this is a time that really calls for the kind of experienced leadership that I brought. I had a strong track record of being a problem solver, being innovative, working extremely hard, and that's, you know, the kind of energy and creativity and innovation that I believe we need right now in a mayor. And then, you know, watching as a community member over this last year, I've seen some really troubling trends at City Hall and just could not sit on the side.
Well, let's dive into that. What troubling trends have you seen?
Well, really a pattern of decision making from this mayor that does not involve the public, does not show respect for the public, a pattern of what I would regard and what one media outlet called, you know, backroom kind of decision making, and that's of concern to me. You know, Austin has a history of really working with the public, of making sure that the measures that come forward are crafted by the public, and you know, that's not really what we're seeing out of our current mayor.
And so has there been a decision, has there been something that has passed, a policy put into place that you feel was the result of that has negatively impacted the city?
Yes, multiple. You know, the first one that I would cite is the mayor's agreement to bring, or the mayor's request that the Department of Public Safety, the state troopers, come in and patrol Austin neighborhoods. You know, that was a decision that he announced at a press conference. It never involved a vote or a discussion of his council colleagues. It never, he never invited the public in to talk about that before unveiling this. You know, the mayor of this city has a responsibility by the charter to make decisions as a council. You know, that individual is one vote on a council. And he unveiled this, again, without collaborating with council members, without receiving public feedback. And you know, that plan ended up with really very bad results. I mean, it ended up in the arrests of, you know, 9 out of 10 of those arrested were people of color. It had, you know, a very negative impact. And some of those, you know, some of those outcomes might have been forecast had there been a fuller conversation with the public and with council colleagues. That's one I would name. You know, I've also watched the council pass policies to change the zoning throughout our city with very little regard for how it was going to impact people's ability to stay in their neighborhoods. I think there were certainly strong concerns expressed that it was going to result in demolitions and displacement of existing residents, and I believe that is a strong and valid concern. And also, you know, I heard members of the public talk about potential environmental concerns with regard to flooding and increasing wildfire risk. And, you know, I didn't see the mayor really making space for a consideration of how they could address those concerns. So, you know, you've seen a pattern of decision making that, again, doesn't involve the public. The public, in that case, came out to express their concerns about those policies, but what passed really didn't take those concerns into account. And of course, most of Austin who follows City Hall is probably aware that because the mayor was improperly cutting off speakers' time at City Council, several people sued successfully and have won back their time. So those are some of the things that caught my attention. There was also a land sale to Oracle. Oracle's lobbyists came down and proposed a deal that is not in the best interests of taxpayers. And the City Council and the mayor voted to, or the majority of the council voted to sell a piece of really valuable parkland to Oracle for a price that I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest is wildly under market value.
I want to talk about some of the issues, particularly one that you just mentioned, and it's one of those things that really impacts all of us living in Austin, and it's water. And you kind of mentioned that when you talked about environmental concerns. Austin has had challenges in managing this very precious natural resource and ensuring that everyone in the city always has access to clean water. What steps would you take as mayor to ensure that there's enough water to not only meet the demand that we currently have, but also in the future as the city continues to grow?
Sure. Well, this is a concern that I addressed as a council member. Actually, we had members of the community come forward and say, hey, Austin is a large city, it's a growing city, and we do not have a long-term water plan to make sure that Austinites of the future will have access to water abundantly. And so as a council member, I initiated a task force and then helped pass what is called Water Forward. It's a 100-year water planning document, and it calls for water conservation measures. It calls for building requirements that are now starting to be passed for big commercial developments. And it also directed the water utility to explore and implement strategies like aquifer water storage. So looking at ways to store water in times so that we have it for the times of need and drought. And so, I feel very, very good about that accomplishment. It was one that I did, again, in conjunction with the community. It was community members' ideas, but we have a great plan now ahead of us. And now, now the rubber meets the road. Now we need the political will to really put those recommendations, turn those recommendations into action and continue to move forward on water conservation. And of course, our water utility needs to continue to invest in its infrastructure to make sure that we're preventing those kinds of situations that we've experienced in the last few years with regard to the need to boil water and some other things. But I feel very confident with the leadership of Austin Water and again with the vigilance of our City Council committee and a mayor who is prepared to be attentive to these issues. I feel confident that going forward we're going to continue to see really strong maintenance of our infrastructure.
Another issue that impacts everyone living in Austin is housing and that direct tie to affordability. But this is not a new issue, right? We have been talking about the need to increase the supply of housing, occupancy rates, and bringing down the cost for at least 13 years. And I know it's been at least 13 years because that's about how long I've been here. So, how can the city truly move the needle on this issue?
Well, I would say, over the last couple of years, Austin has produced more housing than most major cities in the country. And so lots of new housing has come on the market and has nothing to do with, the sweeping zoning changes that the current council has just passed. It is something absolutely that, I know my council talked about. One of the things that I did as a council member was to pass a few resolutions prior to leaving to make it easier to build accessory dwelling units, and as importantly, to provide a loan program that would help low and moderate income homeowners to access the capital they would need to be able to really use that kind of change. That loan program, unfortunately, hasn't been created. I know the current council just asked staff again to take a look at it. But those are the kinds of strategies that we really need to put in place so that homeowners have those kinds of options. There is no one answer to this. It's very challenging to intervene in a market, especially when that market is being driven by a variety of forces. But we need to do everything we can to increase our supply of affordable housing, and I would say to really work and be thoughtful about how major zoning changes could impact people who are living here. So I talked a minute ago about some of my concerns about the home 1 and 2 measures and the ways in which those could actually contribute to displacement of existing residents. We need to be really thoughtful of that. How might zoning changes increase redevelopment and make it more challenging for renters and homeowners to stay in their neighborhoods? So the first measure I would say is careful, thoughtful, deliberative planning that accompanies major zoning changes with real strong anti-displacement measures. And then we need to be continuing to move forward in creating affordable housing. And shall I talk about that?
You can.
As a council member, I helped champion and more than $600 million worth of affordable housing bonds that the voters of this city supported. Those projects are being created throughout the city. Some of them, of course, are already online and providing housing to families of all sizes. We also need to be working on how we can continue to preserve some of the existing affordable housing that's not subsidized, what is naturally occurring affordable housing. And again, I think we do that by being thoughtful about how changes or policies that the city takes might impact redevelopment. But we also have an incredible opportunity with regard to city-owned land. So the city has properties throughout the city that it may not be using right now for city purposes. And so those are really good opportunities to partner with the private sector, partner with nonprofits, and create some market rate housing, but also, importantly, some affordable housing. And this is an idea I championed as a council member. A couple of those projects have now moved forward. We have one that is now in process on Ryan Drive, and we have another great opportunity downtown on the former Health South tract that, as mayor, I really look forward to championing and continuing to move forward.
I want to take a step back and talk about some of your concerns with the home initiative, because you've talked about how zoning and the impact that zoning can have. You were a council member during Code Next, which would have been a sweeping change, a sweeping rewrite of the land development code, which obviously there were issues in the courtroom that stopped that from happening. The next iteration of it, if you will, was Home 2, and there are concerns there. There are concerns all the way around, but wouldn't you agree that if you continue to do nothing and make no changes, people are going to be forced out of their homes anyway?
Nobody was arguing that there be no changes. And I certainly voiced concerns against Code Next and have about Home 2 and Home 1 and 2, and they're similar concerns. I would say, the sweeping changes posed in Code Next at least included an equity overlay, which would have looked at those areas that are most vulnerable to displacement and most vulnerable to gentrification, and really worked to treat those areas a little differently and use some anti-displacement strategies that were appropriate to helping keep folks in their homes in that area, in those areas. That was an idea and an issue that was raised during Home 1 and 2 and that the council has not contended with.
What can the city, the mayor, the city council actually do? Tell me an example of one of those strategies. For
example, one is making sure that there are not incentives for demolition. And so they have passed this with a kind of preservation suggestion, but it is not strong enough to make sure that we're doing everything we can to keep existing structures on the property. And so, I'll give you one example. One of the first permits to be filed is a property over on Holly Avenue. And if you look at the Google Maps, you'll see, a very nice, smaller sized house on a very large lot. Well, the owner of that lot put in a permit and for home and is going to construct 3 houses according to the permit and has now demolished that one house. It would have been better, in my opinion and in the opinion of others, if there had been a stronger incentive to keep that house and just add to the lot rather than demolishing the existing structure. Because when you see these demolitions, and as a District 9 representative, I saw a lot of it, developers who come in, investors usually, who demolish the existing housing and then build new housing, and that new housing is never going to be cheaper than what was on that tract. And it's very often displacing renters, others who relied on that housing.
The new housing is never going to be cheaper, but if you add housing around that structure, around the existing house, isn't that going to increase the property value? So then you're going to have some property tax issues that come along with living in that house as well. So it seems like you can't win for losing on that.
Well, but I do think, I do think there are some measures that would help. And again, doing everything we can to encourage, I mean, if you're providing additional incentives to people in the form of increased zoning entitlements, you're allowing them to build more on an existing lot, really encouraging them to keep, or requiring them to keep the existing structure would be helpful. The other real measure that I wanted the council to attend to is short-term rentals. The Home 1 does not prohibit short-term rentals if you're building 3 structures. I believe it does if you're building 2. But when it passed, the way it was written, and because they were moving kind of quickly, I think there was an intent to prohibit short-term rentals, but they didn't successfully do it on tracks with 3 properties. So if you're building 3 units, 2 of those, at least, can be investor-owned short-term rentals. They can be short-term rentals 100% of the time. So here's a measure that was designed to produce more housing that can, in fact, provide property owners with the ability to do hotels. That's the kind of example of where a rush to do something, really can prevent better policy making.
Is there anything in Home 1 or Home 2 that you think was positive, that is going to move the city forward?
Well, as I said, I supported adding accessory dwelling units. I thought that there was a lot of support for it. That's a kind of gentle density that I think makes sense in our interior neighborhoods. Adding that second unit, lots of areas of town already have that ability, but not all of them. And so coupled with a loan program that actually made it feasible for more people to do it, that I think made sense. It certainly, I've always supported increasing density along our corridors, making sure that we're doing everything we can to increase density in those areas makes sense. And I'm always going to argue that when there are increases in entitlements and zoning entitlements, there should always be an affordable housing benefit. And that's not something we saw in Home 1 or 2. Had I been on council, I would have argued for one. If not one of those 3 units, at least some kind of affordable housing contribution to help make sure that the housing that's being built is going part of the way to helping address one of our biggest challenges. Because while we've seen all of this new housing coming on the market over the last couple of years, very little of it is affordable. The only affordable housing we're seeing is that are the units that are really designed to be affordable, that are required to be affordable. So, we need to make sure that the housing that's coming online really addresses the needs of all Austinites, is aimed at those with less income as well.
Obviously, the rent or the mortgage is only one piece of the puzzle when we talk about affordability in the city. There's also people having to pay higher fees for utilities and services. I feel like years and years ago, Austin city leaders had a mantra that growth should pay for itself. And so that growth should help fund the advancements that you need in those utilities to cover those fees. But now we're seeing fee increases almost annually every time there's a new budget within the city. What's changed?
Well, I would say I saw a lack of scrutiny, frankly, this year with the mayor and the council in terms of fees. There were very large increases in fees and that can really impact a family's budget. So, as a council member, one of the things I championed and led on was making sure that our utility hookup fees were covered at 100%. We had, for a long time, big developers were only paying 50% of those costs. And it was a really shrewd, very engaged community member, Shooty Fath, who came forward and said, hey, we should be collecting 100% of those costs. It made sense when Austin was trying to encourage development to give big developers a break. It doesn't make sense at a time of growth and development, where we see lots of development coming online. So, we are charging the cost of those electricity hookups, and we did the same with water, and we did the same with development services fees. But it may be time to look at those again and make sure that all of those costs are being covered by the fees. We should always be looking at the kinds of fees that we're assessing customers to make sure they're covering the actual costs. But we also need a council that's going to scrutinize it. As a council member, I pushed back on electricity rates successfully the first time, not so successfully with our more recent rate a couple years ago. I didn't support it. I thought it was unwise. But we didn't see a lot of conversation during this year's budget about the fees. Let me give you one example. Austin Resource Recovery increased its fees, and one of their new ideas was to create a warehouse with used furniture. that would be accessible to individuals experiencing homelessness who are moving into permanent housing. Well, that's certainly a need for individuals leaving our bridge shelters who are moving into permanent housing. But I didn't hear any analysis of whether the city was the right person to actually be providing that service. It very likely would have been cheaper to provide individuals with vouchers to go to one of our existing thrift stores that have, lots of used furniture already. Whether the city needed to take on this new enterprise was not a question I heard council members and the mayor really talking about. So, that level of deep dive is something that we all have a right to expect of our elected leaders. Looking at every element of the budget to see, are these services still things we need to be providing? Are these increases really justified? That's the kind of council member I was, that's the kind of mayor I'll be.
Mayor Kurt Watson points out that you have in the past voted against a homestead exemption, increasing the homestead exemption. What do you want voters to know about the vote then and how you would handle things going forward?
Sure. Well, I would start by pointing out that I actually brought forward the first ever measure to create the homestead exemption. So it was my leadership that actually created the homestead exemption. And it was a very low homestead exemption at that time. We had a lot of conversation among the councils I served on about how to handle the homestead exemption equitably, because it does give the biggest break to those with the highest dollar housing, and it takes a lot of money out of the budget. And so that we had some really thoughtful conversations early on as that homestead exemption increased and increased. Number one, that it would be better if we had the ability to do just a flat rate, which would be a more equitable system. We do not under state law. And so I brought forward a measure that we continue to advocate for legislative change that would allow us that flexibility. It would be great to have more flexibility with how we do homestead exemption and frankly how we assess taxes. So there were years where I didn't support it because it was increasing at a time where I felt it was really having an impact on some of our services potentially that the city was offering. When the city's financing changed a bit because of state legislative changes, I certainly did support the homestead exemption. So the mayor's characterization of that just frankly is inaccurate. I absolutely did vote against it a couple of years, but I've also supported it as well. And again, created it. For many families, especially families with children, childcare, transportation and childcare are issues. So, transportation is one of the highest dollar costs next to housing, but for families with children, childcare is. And so, it is important that the council also continue to invest in public transportation. I've been a longtime supporter of public transportation. I've also been a longtime advocate and somebody who has supported policies that really work to expand our childcare network, both for city employees but also for community members. And so, these are the kinds of broad-based affordability issues that we need to be concerned with. And I would also mention school finance. As a council member, I was very involved in working with our local school district on a range of issues and support, from stepping up and leading the initiative to help fund some after-school programs at Title I schools and some other programs that were really critical during the pandemic. For example, I led in getting funding so that we would have so that caregivers of AISD students could access free meals at the same time their students did. The school district was providing free meals to students within AISD, and we were hearing reports in my office that families were sharing those meals because that was the only access they had. And so the city's funding was able to use some of its federal funding to pay for that piece. And so, more than 1 million meals were served to the parents and caregivers of AISD students as a result of my leadership on that. And it also helped preserve about 100 jobs because local restaurants supplied that need. So it was a great win during the pandemic. But we need a mayor and we need a council who is going to continue to be supporting public education, and we need to support our school districts in lobbying at the legislature for school finance reform.
When we think about that, there was talk about the tax swap. I'm sure you remember this, about seeing what things the city could pay for. Is that a good use of the dollars, you think? Can we continue to do that or start to do that?
Well, unfortunately, the city is facing some real budget constrictions too in upcoming years. So we're Our ability to continue to support programs may be limited, but I absolutely think it should be a high priority to continue to look for ways that the city can support Austin families. And we've been able to do that through after-school programs, through the family resource centers, by helping fund parent-teacher support specialists. We need some of our other community partners, including Travis County, to participate in this work as well, perhaps to a larger extent. And something like the formal tax swap was an interesting idea, and I was certainly supportive of looking into it. It's very, very complicated, but continuing to look for those other ways to partner with the school, with AISD, but also other school districts within our boundaries is very important. I think there are a lot of ways that we can really leverage the resources of the city, and also resources and partnerships with other entities to provide more value for Austin residents. And that's going to require a lot of innovation, a lot of problem solving, but that is the way that I think we can continue to fund and expand services through partnerships, because our ability to generate new revenue is limited. So we're going to have to be extremely careful about how we spend taxpayer dollars, but also really creative about the kinds of partnerships that can help us expand services and meet the growing needs and challenges that Austinites are facing.
The number of people who can't afford a place to live and therefore experience homelessness here in Austin is just steadily increasing. ECHO, or the Ending Community Homelessness Coalition, estimates some 5,000 people don't have shelter, and another 1,200 are in shelters, in emergency shelters, transitional housing. It's very easy, I think, to say that the goal is to end homelessness, but the actual metrics to measure that success are a little harder. We know that people can experience homelessness. It's fluid. It's not always a stagnant, situation. If you are elected mayor, what's the metric that you're going to use to measure the progress of how you're addressing homelessness?
Well, there are a couple different metrics, and I'm going to look to groups like ECHO that uses national best practices and other organizations that use some of those national best practices. I think we need to be concerned about a couple different metrics. One is the success that organizations have in helping formerly unhoused folks stay in their housing. And Austin actually, and its nonprofit partners, has a great success rate of keeping individuals in their housing once they're housed. They largely do not return to homelessness. And so that's very, very important metric, because we know the programs that we're investing in are successful at eliminating homelessness for many of our neighbors. But we also need to keep an eye on the number, the overall number of individuals experiencing homelessness that we have, but also how that number is increasing or decreasing. And I want to say, as a council member, as a mayor pro tem, I focused on this issue. This was a key priority for my office. I even chaired the community advisory board for ECHO for a time, and worked really closely with individuals with experience, with housing providers, to do a lot of different things, including supporting the development of the homelessness outreach street team and others. And we need a mayor who's going to be a champion of this issue, because we have some opportunities ahead. The council I served on made some very significant historic investments with our federal dollars after the pandemic, or during the pandemic, in working to end homelessness, and those investments are paying off. We have hundreds of new units that have come online that are offering permanent supportive housing to individuals who are formerly homeless. Just in the last, between last week and the next couple weeks, there are 3 major developments that are opening, Pecan Gardens being one of them. And so, we know those investments are now bearing fruit, and it's great. We need to continue to invest in the whole response system, from preventing families and individuals from falling into homelessness, to really making sure that we've got supportive services for those who are in permanent housing. And we need a mayor who's going to be a champion of getting more of the community involved in this work. We need the private sector to step up and really partner with us in working to make homelessness, brief, rare, non-reoccurring. That's how we're going to end homelessness, with that kind of broader-based partnership, because the city will never have the financial resources it needs to do all of this work on its own. And we have had some success in getting private partners to come to come and work on this issue and to invest in it. But we need a broader array of them. But those are a couple of the metrics that I think we should be focused on. Again, how successful our programs are. And I know people want to put costs to individuals served, and that's really challenging because if you're serving a family that is behind on its rent and just needs a little support to help them stay in it, it's obviously going to be much less costly in terms of the investment for services and for housing than for somebody who may have a variety of physical needs as well from having been experiencing homelessness for a decade or more. The costs are going to be different because the needs are very different.
I want to ask you a couple of questions from viewers as well. C. Goodwin from Southwest Austin wants to know how you will specifically address mental health treatment and drug addiction rehab within the homeless community.
Well, we have some great new resources, and I really appreciate that question. It's a very important one. Both of those areas have been lacking in terms of investment and resources here in Austin. And as a council member, one of the things I did was to lead the council in opening the Sobering Center, a partnership with Travis County. It wasn't my idea, but I was able to bring forward that really great idea from Judge Hohengarten and others who really had expert knowledge to know that this was a resource we need. And that serves a range of individuals. Some are experiencing homelessness, many are not, but it is an important resource that diverts individuals who are publicly intoxicated from our emergency room and our jails and provides them a safe place to sober up. But for those who are ready and interested and for whom it's appropriate, it also connects them to those substance use resources that can be of help. And I'm super excited about the mental health diversion program that Travis County has now launched. And I know the city is a partner in that, and I hope the city will continue to be a partner of that. And as mayor, as a council member, I supported that idea in concept when it was a concept, and as mayor, I'm going to be a champion of it because it is exactly what we need, that kind of place where individuals who are having mental health issues can be taken so that they're not in jail, they're not in our emergency rooms, they're taken to a place that can provide that kind of support. And of course, we need to expand those resources as well. And especially those longer term supports for substance use, for mental health.
Austinites recognize the need for transportation infrastructure, and so they passed a very bold vision, a very bold plan in Project Connect. But we are all well aware now that what people saw on the renderings and what they thought that they were going to be getting is not exactly what is going to be built, at least not anytime soon. What would you do as mayor to restore the public confidence in Project Connect?
Well, I thought the conversations leading up to that vote were very important, and there was clearly a lot of support. I thought those who were really out there in the community explaining the plan, explaining the different phases of it, did a great job of working to provide the kind of education that helped people understand why it was so important to move forward with this rail system. And I think we need to move forward and do the same kind of community outreach because there are, questions about it citywide. I share in the disappointment that others feel about the fact that it had to be scaled back because of the increased cost, but I'm still supportive of it. And as mayor, I'm going to continue to be a champion of it. I'm going to continue to talk about why it's so important. It is a bold vision, and it's one that is going to have really important environmental impacts, in reducing pollution, getting more people into an option that doesn't involve, cars, so it's going to reduce traffic on our streets. So from an environmental perspective, from a quality of life perspective, it's still the right direction to go in my opinion. And so I think that having a mayor who's really out there having that conversation with people, but also encouraging the Project Connect folks to get out there and do the kind of community outreach that they did when they were generating support. They need to go out and really build that trust back and talk about, if this is where we are now and this is our immediate plan, but here's how we're going to work to address those needs of providing public transportation citywide and hearing and making sure they understand those needs, because we need buses, to go to areas where they're not currently going. We need those rapid bus transit. We need those rapid bus lines to go to areas where people are transit dependent and it takes them hours to get to where they need to go. And so, we need a transportation system that continues to be in close contact with our community, hearing those needs and working to meet them. And if rail is not getting to them in this phase, we need to plan for making sure that it's going to get there very soon.
Because the project in and of itself, Project Connect, is run through the Austin Transit Partnership, there's a lot of questions about the funding mechanism. It was the subject of a bill in the legislature, and we can certainly expect that to happen again, I think, when lawmakers reconvene in 2025 in January. There are lawsuits about the funding. Do you see a conflict with how Project Connect is being funded, a conflict with the Transit Partnership?
I don't. That funding mechanism was explained to the voters, and they overwhelmingly supported it. And
do you think it was explained to them clearly?
I do. I'm certainly aware that not everyone in the community feels that way, and clearly the folks who filed the lawsuit don't. But it did seem clear to me, and I was very concerned that it might not pass, frankly, because it was going forward at a time where people were out of work or their financial futures were uncertain. It was during the pandemic, and the fact that they overwhelmingly supported Project Connect, even given those, the financial concerns that were writ large across the community, means to me that there was a tremendous amount of support for it. And so, as mayor, I'm going to honor that support and continue to be encouraging us to move forward with Project Connect. Of course, if the courts come back and say we need to take a different path, I'm going to support that as well and work to see, work with the community, work with other public partners to figure out, what we do next. But we still need to move forward with getting that citywide vision implemented and getting started on it.
And obviously the mayor is only kind of one player, right, in all of everything going on with ATP and with Project Connect. But as mayor, if you are elected, specifically when we think about the rail, when do you want to see something happening with it, people being able to see some progress?
Oh my goodness, as soon as we sort out the legal situation, we need to begin making progress. I mean, I would have, and I did support it decades ago, so I wish that we already had it in place. I wish some of those earlier measures had passed. But we're only going to, we shouldn't lose any more time because those costs are just going to escalate. And this is an option that people need, and they need it as soon as possible. Now, again, as mayor, as you said, I would only be one party in that conversation. But it is important to continue to bring that level of scrutiny, financial scrutiny, making sure that's one reason why the city is a partner on that Austin Transit Partnership. We need to be sure that we're protecting taxpayers' interests and making sure that the project is well managed, that the funding is well managed, that we're all very open and transparent about, every step of the way and keeping in close communication with our community.
I want to talk about public safety. I think it is fair to say that there is a disconnect between what the public expects to happen when they call 911 and what is actually happening, right now. Whether it's a car crash and you need an officer to come out and do a report for your insurance company, or whether you get home and your home has been burglarized and you feel like you need help. When people call 911, they expect an officer to come to them, and that's just not happening right now.
Well, let me start by saying everyone in this community deserves to feel safe, and they need to know that when they call 911, they're going to get a response that is rapid and that is helpful. The city had shifted to a system of more reporting online for non-emergency. I mean, we always want to be thoughtful about taxpayer expenditures, and not every call to 911 should be met with a police response. Some of those issues are really not emergencies and can be handled in a different manner. Some of them are better handled by a mental health professional. And so, I'm really glad that we now have that option. That was something that I supported as a council member, having that mental health option in 911. But we need to make sure that we never get to those levels of staffing with our 911 operators that we did. We had a very, very large shortage of 911 officers, and the council had to bring it to the attention of the manager. That should never happen. We were able to immediately respond by increasing wages for 911 operators, which has helped, and now they are, back up to a better staffing level. But we really need a manager. We need to be sure that the city manager is going to keep an eye on those critical areas of need and make sure that the staffing levels never drop to a point where where it is posing a safety risk. So we need to be sure that our 911 operators are able to respond. And we need to hear from the public about, are there issues that are currently handled as non-emergency issues or as reporting issues that the police are not responding to, where they would like to see a policy change? And of course that means, passing a contract and continuing to do everything we can to recruit officers to fill those vacancies. We have a staffing shortage among our police force that has to be addressed and is being addressed, but it's taken this council, this current administration, a long time to have a contract to actually vote on. They turned one down, a year ago, more than a year ago. We now have another one on the table that has, we'll see what happens in their next vote, but we need our new police chief to really think about, why are our academies not full? And why are cadets leaving the academy? What does that attrition look like? And how we can do a better job as a community and as a council of supporting our officers so that they stay and want to work here in Austin.
You point to the issues with the contract and what's going on with the current administration, but do you feel as though you and the previous council bear any responsibility for the decision that halted cadet classes and that some have seen as really the catalyst for where we are right now when it comes to police staffing?
Well, there were several things coming together at once. You had a lot of retirements happening, a large number of officers who were eligible for retirement. We had a national conversation about policing that certainly has impacted, and absolutely we bear responsibility for halting the cadet classes. And I still contend that we needed a revision to that cadet academy curriculum, and we had actually called for it in the fall of that year and passed a resolution directing the manager to address this issue. And we did so because we had cadets coming forward to the council who had left the academy and were whistleblowers. They were calling attention to some real systemically concerning practices within the academy that had to be addressed. At the same time, we had some high-ranking police officers whose racist texts and conversation was exposed in the public. I mean, these were issues that had to be addressed. And the council did the right thing in telling the manager, these are issues that need to be addressed. So fast forward to the budget, and we got to a budget, and none of that work had happened. And we were in the midst of a pandemic, but it still needed to have been a priority. And so holding back the funding for those cadet academies to make sure that those changes happened certainly seemed like the way to make sure that those changes happened on a timely fashion. Now, where I think we needed to do a better job was communicating to the public about what we were doing and what we weren't doing, and also making sure that our officers continued to feel supported during that time. And that's an area where I think as a leader, I certainly needed to do a better job.
If you could go back, what would you have done differently?
Well, alerted the manager, been more vigilant about making sure the manager followed up on that resolution so that we didn't get to the point where we had to hold back the funding for the academies, that work had begun and was happening in earnest by the time the budget came around so that we could have proceeded with those cadet academies.
So moving forward, if you're elected mayor, how would you work to ensure that we don't get into another situation where we have hundreds of vacancies within the police department?
Well, number one, we need to have really frequent conversations about what those staffing levels look like in public safety more generally, from 911 to our firefighters to EMS to police, because those are areas of such critical importance. And so that is something that perhaps the audit committee or the public safety committee of council could keep in regular contact with the manager about. But it needs to be a priority communicated to the manager that this is his responsibility to make sure that the staffing levels are remaining at an adequate level and increasing to the point where we need. And if there are policy changes or budgetary concerns that need to be brought to the council, that he will feel free to do that so that we have forward movement and forward progress on this. And then as mayor, it is absolutely a concern and a priority for me to make sure that we are mending that division with our public safety officers, especially the police, and that we're also, though, making sure that we're moving forward in the way that the voters expect with the accountability measures that were passed overwhelmingly at the polls. So we need to do all of those things. We need to make sure that we are continuing to improve that cadet academy, that we're supporting our officers and making sure they feel valued, and we need to make sure that we are implementing those accountability measures.
Are you hopeful that the contract that the council is poised to pass with those, increases, those pay increases, that's going to be enough to increase recruitment?
It is. Officers in Austin have been well paid for a while, and so there may be other measures that we need to consider, and I don't know yet what those are, but I think they need to be a concern of our police chief. Nationally, it's an issue. Recruiting public safety officers is a national issue. It's not just something that we here in Austin are facing, and so understanding what some of those considerations are, why more people aren't interested in getting into public safety is important. I think there are some things that we might be able to try here in Austin. We have a firefighting academy, for example, in one of our high schools that encourages young people to think about that as a career. We could do the same for the police. We could contemplate having some kind of police or police academy for young people, a program that would maybe be done in partnership with Travis County and other entities to encourage high schoolers to consider that as a career and really train and mentor. But to do that, we would need to be a little creative about thinking about what our needs are in the future. But incentivizing Austinites to consider that as a career would be of value, and an idea that I've raised in the past and Councilmember Houston has, as former Councilmember Houston and others have as well. How can we incentivize, in particular, our police force to live within the city of Austin? That's something that we've talked about. We even were able to get a measure put in the contract to allow for that kind of incentive back in the day, but we've never really moved forward with a plan. I had passed a measure to get the staff working on that, and I don't believe it's moved forward, but it would still be a good value. More officers living within the city of Austin would be a help.
A few questions from some of our viewers. Kai from downtown says that Austin was once viewed as booming for tech. Apartments and new buildings started rising, and so did the rents. Post-COVID and economic downturns, tech has seen layoff after layoff. They personally have been through 3 of those layoffs so far. Office buildings, once lively, now sit empty. However, rent prices are still on the rise and have not changed. What will you do to bring tech jobs back to Austin?
Well, continue to communicate the wonderful climate we have for tech here in Austin. And by climate, I'm not necessarily talking about the temperature, which is very hot, as we all know. But that Austin is a place that wants to see those jobs and those opportunities, that we have a talented workforce. The mayor, has a strong role to play as a spokesperson for this city, and that's certainly something that I would do and work closely with, our various chambers of commerce to make sure that we're communicating that interest and that need out in the community, out nationally. With regard to the other concern that this individual raised, we do need to do something about the vacancies downtown, and I'm glad to see the Downtown Austin Alliance working with some of those vacant properties to see if there are temporary uses that can be brought into those spaces so that we have a downtown that is appealing. But we do need to recognize that more and more offices are going to be moving toward a telework, are going to continue with the telework policies that they implemented during the pandemic, and that's a good thing for many employees. That allows them to have a better work-life balance. It gets cars off the road, so it's helpful from an environmental perspective. But we still need solutions for those vacant properties. And so, I really feel for the person who wrote. Being through 3 layoffs has to be extremely stressful. And so, I am absolutely committed to making sure that, to the extent we can as a city, council as a city, that we're doing everything we can to make sure that Austin is a great place to do business, and that it's a great place to live, and that that we have policies to support that.
Jose from South Austin wants to know why you think Austinites should not re-elect Kurt Watson.
Well, we have seen in this current administration a closing, an unwelcomeness, in my opinion, to public comment at council meetings, and an unwillingness to really work with the public to craft solutions together. And I believe we need a mayor who has a broader vision, who really wants to move the city into the future on a variety of areas, who's going to be a climate change champion, a climate champion. What we've seen is, the mayor on the message board over the 4th of July weekend closing down conversations about a climate bond, for example. I'm not sure whether it would have been the right thing to move forward with that bond or not, but what I know is we needed to have a conversation. We needed to hear our city council have a conversation about it that involved the public. And so I would say for some of those reasons, for open and transparent government, we need a change. That's not the kind of administration that we have in office currently. We have a lot of behind-the-scenes conversations, behind-the-scenes deals that don't benefit the people of Austin.
If you are elected mayor, after that first term, those 4 years are over, what is the one thing that you would want to be different in the city?
Oh my goodness, well, I have a whole list of goals, so picking one is challenging.
You've got to pick the top one thing, the tangible thing that would be different after your first term as mayor if you're elected.
Well, I would like to see more, if I had to pick one thing, I would like to see more Austinites with the ability to stay in this community and engage in it. And so addressing issues of affordability and having some tangible progress on that, where we see fewer Austinites being pushed out of Austin against their will, would be the number one thing.
How would you measure that?
Well, we do have some ways of measuring that by seeing kind of how the population here is changing economically and how the surrounding areas are changing. I mean, we can make some assessments, our demographer makes some assessments about how Austin's population is changing. For example, our demographer a few years ago pointed out that, Austin's median income is rising, but it doesn't necessarily mean, and probably doesn't mean, that Austinites are becoming more financially well off, because what we're seeing in the surrounding communities is that they're seeing increases in population as Austin loses folks. So some measure of those two kinds of variables.
Give our viewers some final thoughts about why they should elect you this November.
Well, what I bring to the job, what I will bring to the job, is 11 plus years of standing up for Austin's working families, of working on innovative projects, getting them done, like the Sobering Center, like Water Forward, like directing our manager to negotiate to bring what became Austin FC to Austin. Every day I got up to go to work, I was thinking about the needs of working families. How can we make Austin a place where everybody has access to the things they need to thrive? And that will continue to be my focus as mayor. I want everybody in the city to be able to access great jobs, great parks, to live in a safe neighborhood, and to be able to stay in their housing. And if they're currently unhoused, to be able to access housing and the services they need to be successful in it. And some of these issues are within the control of the City Council. A lot of them, though, we're going to need the partnership of other entities and, our private sector, our nonprofits. But, working together with, as mayor, I believe in open and transparent government. I believe in working with the community to build those solutions, to craft those solutions to our biggest challenges together. And I've got a strong track record of doing that as a council member, so you can count on me as mayor to do just exactly that. Got a record of getting things done, lots of things done, and getting them done well.